second scripture comes from the book of John. And I'm reading it to you from the New American Standard Bible. I did that on purpose. It is the closest translation we can get to the Greek that we have right now. And that's why I'm reading it, because I want you to hear the nuances in here. And by the way, I want you to know that when I read this, there are some words in here, and Mel will know this, that are actually in italics that you can't see, that were never in the original translation. And things like he said, she said, they weren't there. So we had to put them in so they'd make a sense. So, but I'll be reading the he said, she saids to you. John 2, 1 through 11. On the third day, there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there, and both Jesus and his disciples were invited to the wedding. When the wine ran out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." And Jesus said to her, "Woman, what does that have to do with us? My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Whatever he says to you, do it." Now there were 6 stone water pots set there for the Jewish custom of purification, containing 20 or 30 gallons each. And Jesus said to them, "Fill the water pots with water." They filled them to the brim. And he said to them, "Draw some out now and take it to the head waiter." So they took it to him. When the head waiter tasted the water, which had become wine, and he did not know where it came from, but the servants who had drawn the water knew, the head waiter called the bridegroom and said to him, "Every man serves the good wine first when the people have drunk freely. Then he serves the poorer wine, but you've kept the good wine until now." This beginning of his signs Jesus did in Cana of Galilee and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. The word of the Lord. Weddings, my friend, weddings are very difficult. How many of you have had a child get married? It's a long process, isn't it? Wedding planning usually takes about a year. The days of planning are often filled with anxiety and stress, and no matter how hard you try to arrange every detail to perfection, rarely do the weddings themselves turn out perfect, and they cost an exorbitant amount of money. I was an on-site wedding coordinator for a very brief period of time while trying to earn extra income. I only took on clients I knew personally, and I did not do any of the pre-wedding planning with them. I instead took on the role of the go-to person on the day of the wedding. Now, there's one wedding that'll always stay in my mind. It was for a distant relative, and I had met them a few times to let them know what I could do for them on the day of the wedding itself. I'd make sure the cake was there, the flowers were there, the caterer arrived, everything was in place. I would tell them where to be when. Go here, go there, right? And then I'd make any necessary announcements. That was my job. That's what I would do. That's it. The rest was up to the family or their real wedding coordinator who moved other things around. Now, this particular bride, a distant cousin, was a bit on the anxious side, so I already had a few reservations. About 2 hours before the ceremony began, I was in the kitchen with the caterer, and the photographer was with the bride. Now, I typically didn't go into the room with the photographer and the bride and the family. It was kind of private time for them. I was focused on coordinating the timing of the event. So I'm down the hall in the kitchen, and all of a sudden I hear a wail, like a very loud wail. You know something's wrong when you hear a wail at a wedding. Apparently, the bride had decided to put on her dress with the help of her maid of honor. Now, that wouldn't have been okay. But no one told her that you never, ever put your lipstick on before you put the dress on. Friends at home, we heard an audible, ah. Yeah. As she pulled her gown over her head, she created a long smear of red on the front of her satin gown. Now, the bride's mother, who was more anxious than the bride, became hysterical. The bride begins to cry uncontrollably. Her mascara now is running down her face. She has black lines down her face and a red smear down her dress. Okay? It was the whole scene kind of resembled the Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus by this point. Okay? Lucky for me, I actually once worked for Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus for a very short time. I did. So I had my arsenal with me, okay? When you do clowning, like I did clowning in the 80s, to set the makeup so it doesn't smear because it's grease-based makeup, you have a sock and you put powder in the sock and then you puff it around your face and it sets the grease. So I always carried baby powder with me and a white cloth to the weddings, just in case this kind of thing would happen. After 30 minutes of working on the dress, the red smear was removed and it left behind a little bit of faint red residue. Mascara was cleaned up, crisis averted, or so I thought. The bride was still so upset and so anxious, she was breathing into a paper sack, okay? She needed support very quickly. 30 minutes, we're gonna have the ceremony. You know, what were we gonna do? So I took aside the bride's mom. I talked to her. Now remember, the bride's mom was pretty anxious as well. And I said, look, go to her. Tell her a funny story. Pull yourself together and be there for your daughter who's ready to fall apart. I nudged the mom enough that she went and sat with her daughter. She got her over her anxiety, both of them did. And by the time the bride was ready to go down the aisle, they were both smiling. Just needed a bit of a nudge. Now, there are many cultural and family expectations that surround a wedding. We have several people in this room that have done and work in weddings, so they know. Now, the bride's family in our American culture typically pays for the wedding. The groom's family, the rehearsal dinner, and in some cultures, a church wedding is absolutely the only way to go. In others, it's okay to have the wedding anywhere. Well, friends, today's scene with Jesus takes place at a wedding. Now, weddings in the first century would typically last 7 days. Feasts were a big part of the wedding scene, and the entire town could be invited. It's a culturally prominent social event, so even if you didn't like the bride and groom or their families, you would attend the wedding. And because these weddings lasted about 7 days, people would often help the families and support them by bringing food and wine to add to the feast. At this wedding party, we're introduced to the mother of Jesus, who is not named. In the book of John, she's not named here. She's not named as Mary. In fact, Mary only appears in the Gospel of John 2 times. Here in Cana at the wedding, and then again at the foot of the cross. It is more than poignant that the mother of Jesus brackets these 2 parts of his life. At the wedding, she's introduced at the beginning of his ministry. And at the end of his ministry, she's there to watch him die. Remember, in the book of John, there's no birth story. Now, we're going to assume that because Jesus and the few disciples he's already called are invited to this wedding, and that it's in some way a family event, or Jesus at least is close to the families who are getting married. The families who are getting married. I said it that way on purpose. Families who are getting married. In the Jewish culture, in this century, the bride and groom are not the centerpiece, but instead the families are. The families. So almost in the beginning of the text, Jesus' mother addresses Jesus with a statement. When the wine ran out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." Now, Jesus' mother seems to have some responsibility for this party because she addresses her son about it. In this socially charged situation, the host of the party would be at risk of losing their honor if the wine ran out before the end of 7 days. It's a long party. It's an expensive one, not unlike the weddings of today. Now, Mary, his mother, is addressing Jesus in a soft way, perhaps an imploring way, for him to do something, especially if he's the oldest son. I would call this a mother's nudge. But Jesus' reply sounds kind of strange to our ear. And Jesus said to her, "Woman, what does that have to do with us? Woman, what does that have to do with us?" The first thing to note about this response is that Jesus refers to his mother as woman. I've mentioned it before, but it's worth saying it again. Jesus is not insulting his mother or being rude. In first century, referring to a female as woman is a term of closeness and endearment. Then he asks her, what does this have to do with us? Just like que pasa is a Spanish idiom, right? What's up? What's happening? It's a phrase. Why do you tell me? What does this have to do with me? Is a Hebrew idiom. It implies a sense of sort of disengagement, not active hostility at all. Jesus is not angry here. He's not being rude. The way he greeted her, woman, paired with this expression is used to kind of downplay that familial relationship between Jesus and Mary, create a sense of distance between them a little bit, and perhaps between him and the situation. But he somehow hears her and his Father above, because he then throws out the big guns. My hour has not yet come. Throughout the Gospel of John, Jesus will refer to his hour, which signals his time of death. Jesus' mother appears to ignore that. Or does she? She turns to the servants and says, whatever he says to you, do it. Talk about a nudge from your mom, you know? She's assuming that he heard her, and being his mother, he'll listen to her and do something about it. Maybe she knows her son and her God very well. So Jesus instructs the servants to fill the 6 pots with water that were by the door, right there in sight, for a reason. These pots of water were used to cleanse the hands of the guests that came through the door. They were clay, so they were considered pure in the Jewish faith. The guests couldn't eat anything at the wedding until they had done purification washing. This meant that water from those canisters would be poured over their hands by the servants, and they would rub them together vigorously to get clean. Jesus then tells the servants to draw out some water and take it to the head waiter. Right away, with this instruction, the servants know something's up. They use this water for pouring over people's hands for purification, not for drawing wine from. Drawing the water from these pots were not part of the ritual at all. No ritual here. This was not what the pots were used for. Yet, they were asked by Jesus to draw from the pots. And what did Mom say? Whatever he says to you, do it. Except when they drew out the liquid out of the pots. It was no longer water. The head waiter was amazed that the wine that was presented to him from the clay pots was so fine. Usually the host would save the best wine for the beginning of the party only because you're going to run out. It's too expensive. But the head waiter had no idea where the wine came from. The scripture ends this way. This beginning of his signs Jesus did in Cana of Galilee and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. By referring to Jesus' miracles as signs, John's gospel shifts attention away from the miracle itself toward the greater reality to which it points. There was a sign of what was to come, a sign of a fully human, fully divine Lord, and Jesus' mother was a catalyst, the nudger. Jesus was called to be God now. Faith-encouraging signs are all around us, friends, telling us how God calls us. But we aren't actually looking for them all the time, are we? We want something spectacular in the form of a sign. How many of you have prayed for a sign before? God, give me a sign. Make it neon. I always say that. Make it neon, right? So I can really see it. But signs aren't always something spectacular. God often chooses something very ordinary to convey his truth to us. Sometimes those signs are in the form of human beings, and sometimes the sign we need to hear, it heads us towards God's call for us, is actually, instead of being a sign, it's a little nudge. Just a little nudge. Just a nudge here, a nudge there. What do you think would have happened if Jesus hadn't turned the water into wine at that wedding? If he hadn't been nudged by his mother, what would have happened? Call it out. What could have happened?
Family would be disgraced.
Family would be disgraced. Oh, yeah. Embarrassment. What else?
The party'd be over sooner.
Party would be over sooner. There'd be no wine. That's correct. Party sooner. Yeah, I mean, it was really an embarrassment. What else would have happened, do you think, if his mom hadn't done that?
Probably an item of conversation for months and months.
Oh, conversation for months and months. Yes. Small town, gossip starts. They couldn't afford it, you know. They couldn't afford it, you know. I mean, you can just see it building, right? I mean, it's a big deal. 7-day wedding, all the expense. But what about Jesus?
You might notice in
He might have noticed himself. He might have. That's possible. It's possible. Maybe he already knew. Although his responses were pretty clear. What's that got to do with me? No, it's not my time yet. His call could have been delayed. His disciples could have taken longer to believe in him. Remember that last sentence. And his disciples believed in him. This was the first sign that they would see. So I guess I'm questioning how important was the nudging to the story. Sometimes we wait to jump into God calls, because we're hesitant to make a commitment, hesitant to trust in God's voice, or just don't want to be bothered right now, kind of complacency. I'm good where I am. I don't want to hear that right now. Sometimes we ignore the nudging. The mom at my relative's wedding was so tied up in her own anxiety and her role as mother of the bride that she forgot that she was still just the mother of a daughter. A daughter. Forget the bride part. She needed to be nudged a bit to be reminded of her real role, just a mom. Is there any call you have put on the back burner or ignored the nudging to? I want you to pray about that. Any call, is there one call that you think maybe could have been put to the back burner and you might need a little nudging on? It's a hard one to think about, but I think this story brings us there. It brings us to the place where God is saying, sorry, son, your time is now. I'm telling you through your mom. How many people do we not listen to that are trying to nudge us towards things that God really has in mind for us? Friends, I'd encourage you to pray about that, about any little call from God. It's never, never, never too late to accept a call from God, something that's been on your heart, something that you've seen and you're wondering about. I think all of us have that in this room, just a little bit of a nudge that we're wondering about, an inkling or something. And I'd encourage you to open that up, give it to God, and pray over it. Because sometimes it can be the most amazing journey that God puts you on. An amazing journey that we could just be ignoring, and we don't know it. So we need to just open up and listen, just like that song said, open our eyes so we can see you, God. Open our ears so we can hear you, God. I'd encourage all of us to do that.